It's been a lot of denials, right, from Joseph Daniels. I didn't do it, or I don't remember. And now we're getting to the part where he's admitting to some things, including the pretty brutal beating of his son, allegedly for peeing on the floor, and then putting him in the trunk of a car, taking him to a field. Does this all add up here to you, Neama?
Doesn't add up. Not much of a defense in this case, but what I expect happened is the state just wanted to get the last portion of that confession where Daniels actually confessed, and the defense was able to get this whole videotaped admission in, including the previous denials, because obviously, as we know from their opening statement, they're arguing that this confession was coerced. But it's going to be very, very difficult for Daniels to get anything, whether it's an acquittal that's out of the possibility or even a hung jury. The evidence for the state here is incredibly strong.
So, Neama, how does this normally work, though, when you have a videotape confession, even coupled with a bunch of denials, and then you recant the story? Does that hold up, in other cases that you've seen?
It doesn't. As prosecutors, we call this a very slow guilty plea. As a state, you can't really offer any type of deal in this case. It's such a heinous crime. I mean, one of the worst things that I'm sure you and I have ever seen. I mean, as attorneys, we're in the business of misery, and we've covered a lot of really just tragic and brutal cases here on the Law and Crime Network. But this one is just beyond the pale.
Sure.
A father killing his biological son. So really, there's no real offer you can make in this case. And for that reason, the defense really is going to just take one sort of swing at the fences, go for a Hail Mary, whatever analogy you want to use, to see if they can maybe pick off one or two jurors. But this case is going to inevitably result in a guilty conviction.
Yeah, and what strikes me is the demeanor of the defendant here. Joseph Daniels at one point broke down in tears. His hands has been in his, holding his head up. He's been slow to answer questions. Usually, if you're not guilty, you want to have more declarative, definitive answers here that cut to the point, that say, definitively, I didn't do this. We heard a little bit of that, but it's been slow, right?
It's been slow. And Derek, you and I were talking offline during the break. I mean, the law enforcement officers here really did an outstanding job. They were incredibly patient, able to slowly, over time, break Joseph Daniels down and get that confession. Now, we know the defense is going to raise, his mental health issues. That's all going to come in. But this was very sort of masterful in terms of getting the confession that they needed in this case.
Right. I mean, this witness is very emotional, breaking down on the stand.
Very powerful testimony, Derek. Not something that I think either of us expected. We thought that maybe this individual's a sociopath, because he was really expressing little to no emotion throughout both the pretrial and trial testimony so far. So seeing this, it does bode well for the prosecution. I don't see anything here that suggests that, Joseph Daniels was coerced, or, law enforcement was overbearing at all. So I can see why the judge did allow this testimony into evidence.
Joe, he described his interrogation as evolving, going from a complete denial of having anything to do with what happened to baby Joe to admitting to violently beating him, putting him in the trunk of a car, taking him to a field. Let's bring in Neama Rahmani here, former federal prosecutor. Neama, the term evolving suggests that this agent finding the story of Joseph Daniels really going from one end to the other in terms of the spectrum.
Derek, Agent Boyd is smooth, both during his interrogation and as a witness. And I love the way he characterizes Daniels's confession, first outright denial, and changing his story, and how he had to establish that rapport and gain trust with him ultimately until he was able to get that confession.
To really outsmart the interrogator, during that interrogation. I mean, sort of spoon feeding him information, being very slow to answer questions, breaking down in uncontrollable tears. It seems like he thinks he can outsmart the interrogator.
No question, Derek, and that's where it starts. But ultimately, he fails miserably because Agent Boyd is 2 steps ahead of him. He's already spoken to Daniels' older son, gotten the information that he needs, and able to get that confession. And I think the fact that Daniels doesn't say, "I killed my son, baby Joe," I don't think that's necessary. State doesn't need it. They already have the admissions that he struck him multiple times in the head, also in the face, put him in the trunk of a car, and ultimately abandoned his body either in the field or, later changed the story to throwing him into the river off a bridge. But whatever he does with the body, I don't think the state needs those magic words. They have plenty of evidence here.
Testimony we've heard so far. Let's bring in our guest here, former Federal Prosecutor Neama Rahmani, criminal defense attorney Anna Yum. Neama, I want to ask you, going back to the videotaped interrogation here, the investigator described it as an evolution of comments made by Joseph Ray Daniels, but we haven't gotten to the actual confession yet, and you're saying we don't need it.
Well, we don't need it because we have so many inconsistent statements by Daniels, and the jury is absolutely going to hate this guy, and they're going to believe that he killed his special needs son. We have his videotaped admissions. We have his written confession where he actually uses the magic words, "I killed baby Joe," and he admits to lying. We have his jail calls, which are going to come into evidence, where he tries to blame Crystal, baby Joe's mom, and his wife. And, now we have this other story that baby Joe may have kind of walked out and someone may have seen him on the side of the road. So, I know defense attorneys have to do their thing, and that's part of our criminal justice system. They're going to throw everything out there and hope the jury latches on to one of these arguments, whether it's the first confession or Crystal doing it, or that baby Joe actually ran off and may actually, but it's not going to fly. And I expect a guilty verdict in this case relatively quickly.
We've talked about the recanting of the confession, but does that really hold up, do you think, after all the testimony we've heard so far and all the evidence that seems to be stacked up against Joseph Daniels?
Derek, doesn't hold up both factually and legally. Once the judge allowed this confession to come in, Daniels was toast, and maybe they want to preserve some issue for appeal, but there's not much there. We watched all day. There's nothing coercive about this interview. There's nothing unlawful about this interview. There's really no appellate issue. So again, really no defense here. And this is, like we said earlier, a real slow guilty plea that we're seeing right here.
In many, parts of this trial, it seems like what's really on trial here is what happened to Kathy Durst, right?
No question, Daniel, and I agree with Anna on this one. We went from one case, which is a very strong case for the prosecution, which now we're moving to Durst, which is much more challenging. We're talking about a murder 20 years ago to cover up a murder that happened 40 years ago. So John Lewin, the deputy district attorney here in LA County, is going back, way back, and he's bringing these witnesses to put forth a very circumstantial case that identifies a motive. And the motive was he killed Susan Berman because she participated in the cover-up of the Kathy Durst murder, and she was extorting Bob Durst. And when Bob Durst decided that he was no longer going to pay her and that she was cooperating with law enforcement, it was time to get rid of her too. So these witnesses are very important for the district attorney's office in this very substantial case that they're presenting to a jury here in Los Angeles.
All right.